we couldn't have conversations in O'odham. And they can have conversations in Spanish. So it was always this sort of, literal multilingualism going on depending on where we were and what we had to do and explain. But yeah, I mean, some of the writing that I did for this project in its first year, it was a little bit of both. I wrote some just in English, and then or else interspersed with O'odham, and then there were an English form and then an O'odham form, and it just really depended on the topic, So for myself, the writing just sort of varied, and I made the decisions myself. And as Martín said, he would see it. Of course, he would work from the English piece and move it to Spanish. So we had this kind of circle going on between the languages, and it seemed to work out, I think, very well. For us, working this way with the texts and the three languages. Yeah. Mm. So, but I think the two other writers, Amber and Silk, they tend to write predominantly in English, and they will use either O'odham. A few O'odham words dispersed or phrases, things like that. Yeah, so they're a slightly different, approach. Yeah.
Oh, very beginning, Spanish was like the language we needed to use to access the communities where images were made. For some reasons, the photography of Gareth focused at the very beginning and throughout the project in communities on the Mexico side of the border. And Gareth knows some Spanish, and so he was able to kind of access these communities also through that, and translation into Spanish and interpretation, like live interpretation, was always kind of necessary, because also most of these traditional leaders or communities we've been working with, they mostly don't speak English, so it was always like through Spanish that we could like share moments with them. So Spanish was always like from the first exhibitions we had to translate and interpret everything. And as Gareth was explaining at the beginning, we started making these images and showing this work in the communities where the images were made and where the Ophelia's poetry was inspired from. And we also wanted to give voice to the people that were hosting us to speak in these exhibitions or to kind of say something. And they were super happy to participate. And they would speak in Spanish and I would be translating. And it was a great experience. And I remember also like this translation thing it's not only in like these formal moments of like exhibitions or translating poems, but one of the things we did a lot in this project was driving. So we will go and pick up the people at the border and we will drive them back. For example, when we went to the Tucson Museum of Art and this big exhibit, we have like a van full of like 11 people coming with us. And we'll pick up on the way in the reservation, for example, Amber or other artists that were collaborating with us. And in that car, it was also like constant translation and interpreting and people sharing their experiences of being O'odham or living on this land through translation. And for example, we get to know that Amber's family member were connected to people that were sitting right next to her on the van through these like interpretation, translation things. So yeah, I guess that it's one of the things that we realized from the very beginning is that the border, I mean, it's not that we realize, it's a fact that the border has separated the O'odham communities, and it's also created like maybe difficult comprehension in between them because they don't share a language, and people were raised speaking Spanish, and here they were raised speaking English, and not everyone speaks O'odham. So I guess that this project also in a way was a sort of a space where they could share and understand some of the stories of other people, collaborators.
And I also think just in terms of, this is also a way photography can work quite well, because it doesn't rely so much on an audio component or on some a lot of like literacy or understanding of a particular language. So the photography is sort of moving between these things. And I think it's really interesting to imagine sort of how the photographs change as the translation is happening next to it. But I think in a way, photography is uniquely sort of situated to exist in these multilingual spaces. And it's part of sort of like, I think, what draws me to photography and the power of photography. But it's also just a utilitarian way to communicate. And, you know, I'm just thinking back to the very early days of working in these communities and, you know, with my broken Spanish, explaining things and sometimes just like reverting to showing photographs and like using the photographs to explain what we were doing was a much shorter and clearer way to help people understand what we were doing. So I think that's like back to the sort of formal element of the project that is well situated for that context.
Mm.
Well, probably, I always remember very clearly the second exhibit that we had was at the Tohono O'odham Community College. And it was just a one afternoon, evening event, and it was very social. You put up the images temporarily in a room, and mostly it was students and some community people that attended, and I read and we talked about the project. But in that case, you know, we did ask people to participate, you know, to tell their own story, whether it was about, you know, their family, if they happened to have families that were separated by the border, or else. And on the O'odham reservations, it's very common to hear stories of people having issues with Border Patrol and other, you know, sort of federal agencies that deal with border issues. And of course, the immigrants that come through the reservation. So we heard some of those stories, but in the end, as the people were looking at the images, you know, even though the images were from families or about families on the Sonora side, many of the people really strongly identified, you know, with whether it was a building or women were outside, you know, cooking or whatever, because the same thing happens, you know, whether you're in Mexico or in the U.S. And so it really resonated with them, and they connected, you know, and they knew they were O'odham, you know, they just happened to be on the Sonora side. And so a lot of conversation came about, and that's when we met, you know, some of our recent collaborators, because they were willing to share so much, and we found out, you know, that they were some were interested in border issues from a political point of view, which is fine, and so some of their writing, you know, kind of come from that direction, and you know, so we were happy to hear them. So it was sort of very, very well-rounded kind of sharing in a small community, which just happened to be a community college. And so those, I thought was, even though it was a very short amount of time, it was quite successful. But the exhibits have evolved, you know, have gotten larger. And I think because we've been learning and so we've, I think, more sophisticated in certain ways, you know, with the way that we did the call and the type of artists that, you know, answered the call, you know, and the one that we chose. So it'll be interesting to what the response will be, you know, in Nogales about this work. Yeah.
Yeah, and about the different media and how they talk to each other. It's true that we started working with well, with poetry, with photography, and with this kind of like essay writing or interviewing, I can have a lot of this content from the first stage of the project. But as soon as we started working with the Fronteridades grant, the aim of the grant was to invite new artists and to commission new work. And at the beginning, we were struggling, like, should we say is photography and poetry only that people can submit work from? And then we decided, okay, we're not gonna just like limit the languages or the aesthetics just to just photography or poetry, and we're gonna just say like artists working with any media, no? And that's how we got like a big variety of people, even people working with like performance art or like theater or script writing, and also people working as was our first as the result of our first commission, that is people working with weaving or with like basket making. And we never thought that this was contradictory with our stance or the first like kind of group of materials that we've developed, or on the contrary. And if you see, for example, Terrell Lou Johnson, Aranda Lash, and Alice Weasley contribution that is called Desert Paper. So they develop paper from desert materials, and they collect this, and they use different methodologies to transform these materials into paper, and then they use this paper to build this like beautiful installation, these beautiful vases. And I mean, it's clear the connection of like paper and writing, and the plasticity or the visuality of these vases with the materiality of the landscape that is shown in photography or that is reflected upon through poetry. So we felt that it was always, and historically the connection of weaving and writing is really clear too, no? And it's been connected as a practice, an artistic practice from a long time. So we always felt that these mediums would work perfectly or will work well in conversation with the photography and the poetry that we were showing at the beginning. And with Monica's work too, I mean, if when we received Monica's submission for the grant, it was clear that she was coming from a completely different position that we've been working on. So it's the first commission that we do of someone who is not out like Tohono O'odham, and we were thinking of like the project was missing this perspective from someone who has experienced migration and lived and raised in border town like Nogales. And her work also, apart from her background, her work combines like writing and image making and work with fabric. So it's really like an installation and video, where her proposal was really wide. Now we're going to show photography on silk prints. But she also proposed having like billboard with text. If you see her proposal, there is a lot of text written about her work. So I think that from one reason or the other, all the artists that kind of connected with the project, in some point they are connected to writing, to image making, and to kind of the materiality of the landscape. And yeah.
I also think her work, which draws a lot on sort of family and genealogy and the family album, sure. And she's sort of thinking a lot about the duality. I mean, anyone who's encountered the border and these two experiences and the ways in which the border has sort of created binaries and created dualism, I think will find her work to be really interesting, because it sort of plays with layering and montages, and while also thinking about collaboration with family members and making work, and then imagining everything in a very installed space and creating something within the gallery that is you can walk around and you can experience.
For me, one of the main aims of the project was to change the narrative about the border, and we were looking at what was the narrative about the border around 2018, And I mean, we were missing this poetic approach to the border, and I think that poetry can bring this like kind of dislocation of language and of the position of the reader that maybe media language was kind of obfuscating, and I believe that that was one of the main reasons why we wanted to bring in poetry into the mix, and especially like encountering Ophelia's poetry that is written from this place and from this landscape. So it will bring in not only the not only what lies beneath poetry as a form of art, but also like the positionality of this writing and of this poetry in here. And from my point of view, this is so I came into the project to write this more like essay or critical text, and there was this article that was kind of trying to reflect on these issues, on the issue of the border, on the issue of Tohono O'odham being separated, but also my expertise maybe comes from human rights and migration and people experiencing these travels, let's say, and while doing that, I also realized, my thinking was coming from like this post-colonial thinking in Latin America, and also coming from the idea that generally knowledge and essay writing and theoretical approaches are generally, kind of built upon or built from like mainstream white colonial approaches. And from a Latin American perspective, there is a group of artists and writers who consider also action as theory. So this was really big in Argentina in the 80s. And then my shift on the project, or my interest on the project, started also changing naturally, also while getting also other funds and while needing to manage, and a kind of that management of the project became more important also. So then I started thinking that maybe instead of like writing essays or writing like theory or like thinking about theory, like the fact of like managing and producing a project and really making these collaborations and like driving from the border and like doing these things was also a way of creating theory about like how a museum can be more inclusive, how a project can foster collaboration. So I think that there's also a format or a language there that is not poetry, that is not essay, that is like in the action of the making of the project that also brings this element. And anyways, I was writing poetry because I'm a writer and I'm a poet too. And the first year that we came here, I was having this extreme insomnia because of the jet lag and this extreme time difference. And I was at night like writing poetry and writing. Well, the poetry that I wrote is more about like the process of getting together and like how we came here and how was I feeling this place. And I was facing all these images of like what is being to be traditional and what is being to be from here, and me not being from here, not even being like a migrant that went through the landscape. So I think that the things that I wrote reflect a bit this position of like feeling outside of the landscape, but at the same time, for some reason, being invited to participate in the conversation. And what is the value of that, and what is the value of this position, you know, like, and I think it comes from this that I'm saying, action and action as theory also. So I think that's why, my contribution kind of shifted throughout the project, and now it's more based in this production side.
I'm wondering if maybe there's something to mention about Amber, and how she. It's also activism, not just.
Yeah, Amber's she's a young woman. She's a student at Tohono O'odham Community College, and she's very involved with, which is sort of something that we see with some young, not just O'odham students, but other Native students, where they come to either their own decision or they're very strongly influenced by someone else, usually someone older, a family member maybe, you know, that the way they were growing up, you know, they had moved away, drifted maybe from, in this case, O'odham culture and the way, you know, to be O'odham. And so even being a student, and the college is on the O'odham Nation, and many of the disciplines that are treated there at the college are very culturally based. Even like if you study biology, the biology classes often integrate traditional O'odham knowledge about biological systems, because we do have our own science as well. So anyway, so you get, you know, that kind of knowledge from, you know, an O'odham traditional knowledge perspective, and also, of course, the mainstream perspective. So you're kind of well balanced in that way. So I think young people like Amber, they go to a college or maybe here, even at the university, and they sort of realize there's different ways that they can access their traditional knowledge. And when she talks about herself, you know, that's something that she's going through right now. And she's very involved with traditional plant knowledge, you know, foods and food sovereignty and so forth. And of course, plant knowledge is an area that she's been studying. At the same time, she also just, I don't know if she's with a group or maybe just herself, you know, took on a role, an activist role, especially with regard to the more recent activity along the border with the wall, and especially this one particular place there called Quitobaquito, which is has water to pond, and it was, you know, damaged, and lots of cactus were damaged or killed because of trying to build a wall in that area. There's a lot of O'odham, a lot of other native people, and also a lot of indigenous people from Mexico came to protest and try and stop that development. And so young people like Amber were very much involved in those protests. So she just has that kind of very clear activism side to her. And so her writing, you know, speaks. Her writing, I don't know that, I'm sure she, her work is used to tell a message, you know, because you can do that with poetry, with, you know, activist poetry, you know, so she uses that medium, you know, to be heard. And so we've, you know, had the opportunity to have her read in different venues with us. And so that's how, you know, I got to know some of her work and the way that she thinks about what she chooses to write about, you know. And then, yeah, other social issues that in general affect O'odham people or other indigenous people, which again, to have those issues be understood or heard, and she just happens to be using poetry to do that. So hers is more messaging, you know, I think. And did you translate her work as well?
Not yet, but I'm going to do it for the essay. But it has and something that happened also similar with Suk. I think that it has like a spoken word quality to the work. So it's completely different to the translating work by you, for example, translating the work of Suk and Amber. And yeah, you have to perform it a bit, no? There is this kind of intonation and this intention that you have to give to the poetry. So when you translate something, you have to be really careful about that and try also to perform it in Spanish, or how it will sound this as a spoken word poem, no? And for me, it was as Ofelia was saying, like we heard from Amber in our first exhibit in the Tohono O'odham Community College, and she just stand up and started reading her poetry, and like 90% was she knew it already by heart, no? Mm-hmm. She already, because it could also sound like a rap, like a song, like a. So yeah, I think it has this quality that is affected by her activism and her discursive part and intention around poetry, and it affects the form, it affects the aesthetic, no? And I feel like we were with this project, we were trying to move away from media discourse around the border and the way the media portrays the border. And one way was to go into poetry and image making and combining these things, but we also found in Amber like a valid way also to portray the border and what's happening in the border without resorting to these like tropes of like a media or but at the same time like having a really strong political stance and an opinion.
Yeah. It is the title of a poem, and then also one of my collections where clouds are formed, which really has nothing to do with the with the border. It's just sort of knowing, certain places, at least the way that I understand where the rain comes from when you live in this area. And so in some sense, it's very literal, sort of meteorological, the weather people show you cloud movement. But I knew a lot of that already because people watch cloud movement. And so I understood some of that. Autumn, love to watch clouds move and try and predict if it's going to rain or not. So I had that knowledge. And then other times I just sort of imagined where clouds were formed. And it's a nice phrase, And I don't know, well, probably Gareth took it from the book because he's the one who used it for this particular project. And it's from this, like, for us here, it's from the southern part, especially for the summer, where the clouds come up from and we get our rains in the summer. But, and the border never stops it. They come. Yeah.
I think I chose it when I was sort of proposing the project, drew it from one of Ofelia's poems. And I think for me, it also sort of has a bit of a symbolic value, just this idea that like, the sky, we impose all these things on the ground, but, the sky doesn't have any of these impositions. And then when I came here, I was very glad that we chose that because it's a really apt title, I think, for this place. And the clouds are really beautiful.